We are now looking at access control mechanisms in clouds. We'll first look at access control on trusted clouds, which means that the users have complete trust in the commercial clouds. All right, so access control, of course, it is a mechanism that controls users how to access hardware resources. There are two types of access control. One is called discretionary access control. The other one is a mandatory access control. So, mandatory access control is provided by the cloud provider. Okay, so which sets up a policy for all resources. Only the policy manager can grant and revoke privileges. So, of course, the cloud provider is the policy manager, and a typical computer system uses password-based authentication with the operating system to provide access control to user files. Okay. However, after you have, let's say you have a you trust a commercial cloud provider, and you trust the mandatory access control provided by the cloud, and you may have the following scenarios. So you run an application using this commercial cloud, and then you yourself also have other users, and so you control certain resources such as CPUs, storage space, and bandwidth that you rent from the cloud service, the cloud provider. And you have users, and you would allow users to use some of these resources. However, you don't want to give up your credentials to your users, right? So of course, if you give out your credential to the users can act just like you to use these resources, but you don't want to because they are your users. So you sort of like, so you rent VMs from or storage space from the cloud provider, and then you want to allow your users to have access to some of the resources you pay for. Okay, so that is the issue. Okay, so to handle this, it is called discretionary access control. So this access control can be done using the following protocol, which is called OAuth, standing for the Open Authentication Protocol. And all the communications between the parties involved in this protocol is on top of HTTP, and using, well, actually is on top of SHTTP using SSL. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at so how this protocol is authenticating a client, and So here there are three entities. Okay, so the server here is the cloud. Okay, you think of this server is a cloud that runs OAuth protocol, and the resource owner is the user who rents VMs in storage space from the server. So the resource owner has certain resources he has access to, but he is also allowed to grant some of the resources he owns. Well, owns means he can use to his clients. Okay, so this client is not a direct client of the cloud. Instead, the resource owner is the direct client of the cloud, but the resource owner has its own users. So we call those clients of the resource owners. Okay, so the client, so there's a resource owner, the client wants to use certain resources under the resource owner's control. So what he would do is to issue a request. Okay, so the authentication request, OAuth request to use some of the resources controlled by the resource owner. And the server, the cloud, issues a temporary tokens indicating that a request has been received from this client. And then the client gets this token and sends, okay, and sends this request to the resource owner. So then it actually opens up a screen for the resource owner to enter its credentials, which means the owner's username and password when the owner pays for the resources obtained from the cloud. Okay, so then, so the resource owner enters his login credentials to the cloud, and then the cloud sends in a request whether the resource owner would grant access to this client. If he says yes, then he will redirect a permission to the client and says, yeah, and then allow the client to get access to some of the resources controlled by the resource owner. And then once the server gets that approval from the resource owner, then the client can request a set of permanent tokens for different types of services. Okay, for storage, you get storage token. For CPU, get CPU token. That sort of things. And then the server provides, the cloud provides the permanent tokens to the client. Then the client can get and use that token, those permanent tokens, to get resources. Okay, so this is in some way similar to Kerberos, but it's much simpler. So we get assets. So then, so client wants resource A. Let's say this is a CPU, so it has permission token to get resources A, and then the server returns resources A, and so on. So during this process, the resource owner can revoke this permission for this particular client. Okay, so this is a assets control for trusted cloud provider. So there are two types. One is mandatory, which is provided by the cloud. The other one is discretionary, that allows the cloud's direct users to grant access to the resources under his control to his clients. Okay. Next, we'll talk about access control in untrusted clouds.